Tonight guys, we begin with something a little less philosophical but no less fascinating, the food served in Wild West saloons. Sure, they were known for whiskey, bar fights, and questionable piano music. But what did people actually eat in those dust-choked establishments? Was it all beans and bacon, or were there surprises hiding behind those swinging doors? Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing that hit you when you walked into a Wild West saloon wasn't the piano music or the sound of someone losing a week's wages at cards. It was the smell. Forget the romanticized scent of sizzling steak and fresh cornbread wafting through polished oak doors. The real bouquet was more like a punch in the nostrils, a complex, layered blend of sweaty cowboys who hadn't seen a bath since the last river crossing, wet tobacco that had been chewed and spit into brass spittoons, old beer that had soured in wooden barrels, damp wood from floorboards soaked with spilled whiskey, and horses that hadn't bathed in a decade standing just outside the batwing doors. If you were lucky, somewhere beneath all that, you might catch the faintest hint of something cooking in the back. Some saloons tried to mask the assault on your senses with sawdust sprinkled liberally on the floor, a common practice meant to absorb the worst of the spills and spittle. Others relied on pipe smoke so thick it could cause temporary memory loss. The more honest establishments simply embraced their olfactory identity. "You don't come here for the air," barkeeps would say, slapping flies off the counter with a rag that hadn't been cleaned since the Civil War. And yet, somehow, there was always a kitchen. It might have been nothing more than a hole-in-the-wall fire pit with a cast-iron pan of beans bubbling over embers that had been burning since Tuesday. It might have been a grumpy woman in a soot-covered apron stirring mystery stew with a spoon that doubled as a self-defense weapon. But food was being made somewhere in that chaos, and if you could smell it through the sweat and the whiskey vapor, you were halfway to dinner. That is, if you could find a seat. Most saloons weren't laid out like modern restaurants. There were no servers gliding between tables with notepads, no menus with scripted fonts describing the day's specials. Instead, you found a few splintered tables that had seen better decades, some rickety chairs held together by hope and the occasional nail, and one long counter where you could eat, drink, argue, or all three in rapid succession without ever changing your position. If you were a regular, the cook might shout something like, "beans or stew," and you'd shout back your choice without looking up from your cards. You knew the drill. You knew what to expect. You knew not to ask questions. If you were new in town, the silence that greeted your arrival was its own language. They'd stare you down from behind the bar, from the card tables, from the dark corners where men sat with their backs to the wall and their hands never far from their holsters. They were trying to guess whether you were going to pay for your meal or pass out before the plate hit the table. That's what made saloon dining so special. It wasn't about taste or presentation or the latest culinary trends sweeping through San Francisco's fancy restaurants. It was about survival. You ate what they had, not what you wanted. You sat next to strangers who might rob you or save your life tomorrow, and there was no way to know which until the moment arrived. And if the food made you sick, well, that's what whiskey was for. In the hierarchy of frontier remedies, a shot of something potent could cure anything from a bullet wound to a questionable plate of eggs. Or at least make you care less about both. In the hierarchy of Wild West cuisine, beans sat squarely at the top. Not because they were delicious, though a well-prepared pot of beans could be genuinely satisfying, but because they were cheap, indestructible, and could survive an apocalypse, a gunfight, and a stampede without breaking a sweat. Pinto beans, black beans, navy beans, it didn't matter. If it was dry, vaguely edible, and could be boiled into submission, it ended up in the pot. Beans were the unsung heroes of saloon kitchens, served morning, noon, and night, often to men who hadn't seen a vegetable since they left Kansas 3 months ago. The preparation was simple. There was no room for culinary pretension when you were cooking for 20 hungry cowboys who had just ridden 40 miles through dust and heat. Step 1. Pour beans into a pot. This wasn't a measured process. You dunked in whatever you had, maybe a pound, maybe 5, depending on how many men were expected and how long since the last supply wagon had made it through. Step 2. Boil them for 6 hours over a questionable fire. The fire might be fueled by mesquite, pine, or whatever wood hadn't been claimed for construction. The heat was inconsistent, the smoke unpredictable, and the cook's patience limited. Step 3. Serve them with salt pork, a stale biscuit, and a look of mild apology that said, "This is what we've got. Take it or leave it." Some cooks tried to get fancy, adding lard for richness, onions if any had survived the journey, or even chili powder if they were feeling ambitious and happened to have some in stock. But most didn't bother. In the Wild West, flavor was considered a luxury, and seasoning was whatever blew in through the open window on a dusty afternoon. Beans were hearty, filling, and predictable, 3 traits that cowboys respected more than gold. They fueled long cattle drives, providing the calories needed to push herds across hundreds of miles of open range. They powered poker nights that lasted until dawn, keeping men at the table long after their luck had run out. They gave you something to chew on while you waited for the piano player to start again, or for someone to get tossed through the front window, whichever came first. The only downside? The aftermath. 1 cowboy eating beans was tolerable. 10 cowboys in a saloon full of beans was a biological weapon of such potency that it could clear a room faster than a shotgun blast. It said that some bar fights weren't started by insults or accusations of cheating at cards, but by a single silent but deadly betrayal near the stove. A man's reputation could be made or broken by how he handled the consequences of a bean-heavy diet. Still, beans were dependable. When the meat ran out, when the chickens fled to parts unknown, and when the cook had exactly 7 brain cells left from the whiskey fumes, the beans remained. Unbothered. Unburnt. Unchanged. Some cowboys even preferred them to more elaborate fare. Beans could be eaten cold, reheated endlessly, and used as makeshift currency in emergencies. Legend has it that a man once bought a horse with 3 pounds of salted beans and a solemn promise never to return to the town where he'd acquired them. So yes, saloon food had its highs and lows. But beans were the baseline. The bedrock. The humble heartbeat of 1,000 dusty meals. You didn't love them. You respected them. And sometimes, on the frontier, that was enough. If beans were the soul of Wild West saloon cuisine, salt pork was its slightly greasier backbone. A slab of fat and meat so tough it could survive a thunderstorm, a bar brawl, and 6 months in a saddlebag without changing texture. It was the cockroach of frontier proteins, impossible to kill, endlessly adaptable, and somehow always present when you least expected it. Salt pork wasn't bacon, though cowboys loved to pretend it was. It was pork belly, heavily salted and often smoked, preserved in barrels with enough brine to season a small ocean. The salt kept it from rotting, a critical consideration in an era before refrigeration, and also, arguably, from being edible. The preservation process transformed the meat into something that existed in a strange limbo between food and building material. Cooked right, salt pork was tolerable. Fried up in a hot skillet until it was crispy and sizzling, it had flavor, grease, and that satisfying crunch that made you briefly forget the rest of your dinner came from a can and had been sitting in a saddlebag since Nebraska. But cooked wrong, which happened often, because frontier cooks were not known for their culinary education or attention to detail, it was like chewing a salted boot heel dipped in axle grease. Your jaw would ache before you'd made it through half a piece. Your teeth would question your life choices. Your stomach would send formal letters of protest to your brain. Still, salt pork had its fans. It was easy to transport, hard to ruin, though many tried, and gave even the blandest pot of beans a salty punch of joy, or at least a reason to drink more whiskey. The salt content alone could dehydrate a man in minutes, which made the whiskey sales that much more profitable. Cooks in saloons didn't waste a single bit of their precious salt pork. The fat was rendered down and used to fry everything from potatoes to biscuits, adding flavor to dishes that otherwise would have tasted like cardboard. The rind was tossed into stews for texture, or given to dogs, or, if the cook was in a particularly cruel mood, to unlucky newcomers who didn't know the difference. One bite, and they'd learn real quick that the barkeep wasn't joking when he said, "Chew slow or choke proud." And yes, sometimes the pork was suspicious. A greenish tinge here. A questionable smell there. A texture that suggested it had been contemplating resurrection. But in saloons, the motto wasn't, "Is it fresh?" It was more like, "Did it kill the last guy?" If not, you gave it a try. Salt pork was versatile, too. It could be diced into beans, slapped on biscuits, fried alone, or gnawed at like jerky on long rides. Cowboys packed it like treasure, tucking slabs into their saddlebags alongside ammunition and tobacco. It was the one thing they could count on when everything else had run out. Saloons leaned on it heavily when the chickens ran off, when the stew pot got too thin, and when the cook needed something, anything, to stretch a meal for unexpected guests. A little salt pork could make a pot of beans feed twice as many men. A little salt pork could turn hardtack into something resembling a meal. A little salt pork could mean the difference between a full stomach and a hungry night. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't healthy. The combination of salt, fat, and questionable preservation would have given any modern nutritionist a heart attack. But in a world where you might ride 60 miles before your next hot meal, salt pork got the job done. And if you survived it, well, you were stronger for it. In the Wild West, stew was the great culinary equalizer. Hot, vaguely meaty, and deeply suspicious, it was the one thing almost every saloon served, no matter how ramshackle the kitchen. Why? Because stew was the perfect cover story for whatever odds and ends the cook had lying around, or couldn't legally describe to paying customers. The base was simple, a pot, a fire, and ambition. You started with water, pulled from whatever source was closest. Hopefully it was clean. Hopefully it wasn't the same trough the horses drank from. But in the frontier, hopefully was a word that got stretched thin. Maybe you added some beans, if there were any left from yesterday. Maybe some potatoes, if they hadn't sprouted or frozen or been eaten by rats. And then you tossed in whatever hadn't walked away yet. Beef? Sure, if the cook was feeling generous and the butcher had made his rounds. Rabbit? Definitely, there were always rabbits, and if you couldn't shoot one, someone in the saloon could. Squirrel? Yep. Rattlesnake? If it wasn't biting anymore, toss it in. One traveler claimed he found a bootstring in his bowl. He wasn't even mad. It was the most chewable part. Meat quality varied wildly. Some stews had tender chunks of beef from the local butcher, evidence that the saloon owner cared about his customers and was willing to pay for quality. Others had meat, the kind you didn't ask about. If the cook looked nervous and the dog population had recently decreased, you just ate around the chewy bits and prayed. Vegetables, when available, were usually boiled into oblivion. Carrots became orange smudges, their flavor surrendered to the broth. Onions disappeared completely, leaving behind only a ghost of their former selves. Potatoes held on the longest, maintaining their shape through sheer stubbornness, but eventually they too surrendered to the simmering heat. The result was a bubbling brown-gray slurry that smelled way better than it looked. There was something about the combination of long-simmered meat, softened vegetables, and rendered fat that created an aroma that could make a hungry man weep. The taste was better than you'd expect, assuming enough salt had been added. And in a frontier saloon, salt was never in short supply. Spices, however, were a luxury. Most stew got its kick from whatever was on the cook's hands, or knife. If you got black pepper, you were in a fancy place, the kind of establishment that had a real sign and maybe even a painted lady at the piano. If you got chili powder, congratulations, your sinuses were about to be cleared by force. It wasn't about flavor. It was about feeling something. But despite the mystery, stew was comfort food for the weary cowboy. It was hot, which mattered more than you might think when you'd spent all day in the saddle with nothing but jerky and dust. It was filling, stretching the precious ingredients into a meal that could satisfy even the hungriest rider. And it could be stretched endlessly by just adding water, a valuable property when unexpected guests showed up or the supply wagon was late. One pot might feed a dozen men, or be reheated 3 days in a row until it developed the consistency and personality of old glue. The flavors would meld and morph, sometimes improving, sometimes becoming something that defied description. But it was food. It was there. And it was warm. You didn't eat stew because it was delicious. You ate it because it was there, because it was warm, and because nothing else in town was edible unless you liked chewing tobacco and regret. Just remember, never ask what's in it. Because in the Wild West, ignorance wasn't just bliss. It was dinner. Not every cowboy could afford a steak, but nearly every saloon had something bread-like to soak up the stew and stretch the meal. That something usually came in one of two forms: soft, flaky biscuits that were heavenly when fresh, or hardtack, which was basically bread's undead cousin. Let's start with the biscuits. When done right, which was rare, but magical, they were warm, buttery, and flaky enough to convince a man he'd stumbled into a proper kitchen instead of a dusty saloon with a cook who might have been a miner last week. Good biscuits could make you forget, for just a moment, that you were eating beans for the 3rd day in a row. Cooks who could make good biscuits were local legends. Their names were spoken with reverence across campfires and card tables. Old Maggie over at the Silver Dollar, a cowboy might say, she makes biscuits so light they float off the plate. Some claimed their secret was lard, rendered from salt pork and saved for just such an occasion. Others swore by buttermilk, though where they got it on the frontier was a mystery best left unexplored. A few probably just had lucky hands and low standards, sometimes that was enough. These biscuits were best served alongside beans or stew, used to mop up whatever broth hadn't burned your tongue. They were often made in cast iron pans, baked over open flames with the kind of care that suggested the cook actually gave a damn. And they were served with a suspicious chunk of butter. If the butter was fresh, it was a sign of prosperity; if it was old, you just pretended not to notice, or a splash of molasses if the place was fancy. And then there was hardtack. Hardtack was a slab of flour and water baked until it could survive nuclear winter. Originally made for soldiers and sailors who needed food that wouldn't spoil on long campaigns, it found its way west thanks to one simple fact: it never went bad. It also barely qualified as food. Eating hardtack required strategy. First, you'd inspect it for weevils. This wasn't a deal-breaker, just an added crunch, a little extra protein that the army had unwittingly provided. Frontier wisdom held that weevils were better than nothing, and if you closed your eyes, you could almost pretend they were pepper. Then you'd soak it in stew, coffee, or whiskey until it softened. This could take anywhere from 10 minutes to 2 presidential terms, depending on the age and density of the hardtack. Some pieces had been baked during the Civil War and were still going strong. Others had been made fresh but still required a commitment to chewing that bordered on religious devotion. Even after soaking, chewing hardtack was a commitment. You didn't just eat it, you grappled with it. You worked it with your teeth, let it soften on your tongue, and hoped that your jaw would outlast the biscuit's will to remain solid. Dentists probably made good money off cowboys who challenged a piece and lost. But here's the thing, both biscuits and hardtack served their purpose. They were cheap, flour and water cost almost nothing compared to meat or eggs. They were portable, easily packed in saddlebags for the trail. They filled you up, providing the calories needed for long days of work. And in a world where calories mattered more than cuisine, that was enough. So if you strolled into a dusty saloon and saw a plate of steaming biscuits, you counted your blessings. You sat down, you ordered a bowl of stew, and you thanked whatever deity you believed in that you'd found a place with standards. If they handed you a hardtack puck the size of your palm, well, at least it came with a story. And maybe a chipped tooth. If you think modern coffee is strong, try Cowboy coffee. This was a brew so potent it didn't just wake you up, it stared back and dared you to blink. Coffee in the Wild West was less about taste and more about survival, a caffeinated punch to the system that could jumpstart a man's day or keep him alert through a long night watch. It wasn't roasted by origin, filtered through fancy gadgets, or topped with oat milk foam art. It was ground roughly, or not at all, dumped into a kettle, and boiled until the liquid turned black and sentient. The standard recipe went like this. Take water from whatever source you had. Hopefully not downstream from the horses, but in the frontier, you took what you could get. Throw in a handful of coffee grounds, measured by instinct and aggression. More grounds meant stronger coffee, and stronger coffee was better coffee. Boil it hard. Don't strain it. Don't question it. Just pour and pray. The result was a thick, dark concoction that smelled like burnt dreams and tasted like vengeance. It wasn't uncommon for the last sip to contain more grounds than liquid, which meant cowboys got both caffeine and fiber in one heroic gulp. The grounds would settle at the bottom of the cup, a sludge of roasted sediment that could be swallowed or spat out, depending on your tolerance for texture. And yet, they loved it. Coffee kept you warm on cold desert mornings when the temperature dropped below freezing and you'd slept on the ground with nothing but a saddle for a pillow. It kept you awake through night watches when the cattle were restless and the wolves were howling and every shadow looked like a rustler. It masked hangovers from the night before, helping you face the day after a particularly enthusiastic session at the card table. And it helped digest questionable stew that might have been sitting in the pot for 3 days. It was fuel, comfort, and punishment all in one tin cup. Saloons didn't always serve coffee unless they had a kitchen and someone willing to tend it. But if they did, it came out boiling hot, probably old, and strong enough to strip paint. One cowboy described it as, like drinking a kick from a mule, but you miss it when it's gone. Fancy folk might have added sugar or canned milk, if the saloon had such luxuries and the cook was feeling generous. Everyone else just grimaced and powered through, letting the bitter heat wake up their senses and prepare them for whatever the day would bring. And if a saloon had been reheating the same pot all day, you'd get the boldest brew known to man. Thick as tar. Twice as resentful. It had been sitting on the stove since breakfast, growing stronger with every passing hour, absorbing the flavors of whatever else had been cooked nearby. By evening, it had achieved a kind of terrible perfection. It's worth noting that some cooks reused old grounds to stretch the pot. This economy method led to coffee that tasted like disappointment and regret, thin and watery with just a hint of what coffee should have been. But it still counted, because in the Wild West, you didn't drink coffee for pleasure. You drank it to feel alive. And stay that way did I in the Wild West. Meat wasn't just food. It was currency, status, and occasionally a test of bravery. If you could afford it, you might walk into a saloon and order a steak. What you got depended entirely on luck, timing, and whether the cook held a personal grudge against your face. Steak, in theory, was a luxury. Fresh beef, cut from a steer that had been butchered that morning, seared over an open flame until it was charred on the outside and tender within. In practice, it was often a tough, overcooked slab of beef that had been fried in a pan with lard, scorched into obedience, and served with exactly zero garnish. If you asked for it medium rare, the cook would just stare at you until your mustache wilted. You get what you get, he'd say, slapping the meat onto a tin plate. And you don't get upset. When fresh beef wasn't available, and let's be honest, it usually wasn't, saloons turned to other options. Dried jerky, preserved with salt and smoke until it was nearly as hard as the hardtack. Salted buffalo, if you were in buffalo country and someone had been lucky on the hunt. Occasionally venison, if a hunter had brought in a deer and was willing to trade for whiskey. Wild boar, if someone had gotten lucky and managed to bring it down before it gored them. And by lucky, we mean managed to hit it and drag it back before the buzzards did. In mining towns or far-flung settlements, meat got more creative. Squirrel stew was common, the small rodents abundant and easy to trap. Rattlesnake roast was a delicacy if you knew how to prepare it, and a quick way to die if you didn't. Roast jackrabbit, with enough seasoning to make it edible, was a staple of the desert frontier. If it had legs and didn't belong to a customer's horse, it was fair game. Sometimes you were served meat and no one told you what it was. That was a sign to eat quietly and not ask questions. If you chewed too long or found something resembling a whisker, you just sipped your whiskey, nodded solemnly, and accepted your fate. There was also the risk of age. Some meats had been hanging around long enough to earn names. Cooks would slice off the bad parts, drown the rest in gravy, and tell you it was well-aged with a straight face. If your plate twitched when you poked it, you were entitled to one raised eyebrow and nothing more. Still, when the meat was fresh and the cook wasn't drunk, or was just the right kind of drunk, you might get a real meal. A sizzling slab of beef, the fat rendering down and crisping at the edges. A fried egg on top, if there were eggs to be had. Maybe a biscuit on the side, if the cook was feeling generous. A plate that reminded you why people survived gunfights, cattle drives, and rattlesnake bites for this. But most of the time, you ate what was there and hoped it didn't eat you back. In a Wild West saloon, dessert wasn't really a category. It was more of a happy accident, the result of a cook with spare ingredients and a tiny sliver of mercy. But if there was one reliable source of frontier comfort, it was cornbread. Made from simple ingredients that were almost always on hand, cornmeal, water or milk, lard, and sometimes a dash of baking powder if the cook remembered, cornbread was the Swiss Army knife of the frontier menu. It could be baked in pans, fried in skillets, or even dropped by spoonfuls into boiling stew if someone was in a hurry or too lazy to make proper biscuits. Alone, cornbread was dry, crumbly, and slightly sweet depending on who made it. The sweetness came from whatever the cook could spare, a little sugar if the supply wagon had come through, molasses if the cook was being stingy, or nothing at all if the cornmeal was all they had. It was always best served fresh, which meant it was almost never fresh. More often, you'd get a wedge that had been sitting near the stove since sunrise, slowly hardening like a miner's conscience. The edges would be crisp, the interior dense, and the whole thing would have absorbed whatever flavors were floating around the kitchen, smoke, grease, and the faint smell of yesterday's stew. But here's where the magic happened. Molasses. A dark, sticky, syrupy miracle that turned dry cornbread into something just shy of glorious. Molasses was the cowboy's frosting, the outlaw's drizzle, the lonely gambler's last bit of joy before losing everything on a bad hand. It was affordable, kept well in the heat, unlike honey, which would ferment and attract bees, and mask the sins of even the driest baked goods. If a saloon had a barrel of it, you were in luck. If they warmed it before serving, you were practically eating at a 5-star establishment by frontier standards. Some cooks went a step further, pouring molasses over skillet-fried cornbread and tossing in a pinch of salt or spice. A little cinnamon if they had it. A dash of nutmeg if they were feeling fancy. It wasn't quite cake, but it felt like it if you'd been chewing jerky and hardtack all week. Cornbread with molasses became the default dessert, quick, cheap, filling, and sweet enough to calm your nerves after a rough ride or a close call in the poker room. No icing. No whipped cream. No frills. Just grit, grain, and gooey satisfaction. And for many, it was more than enough. Because when your life involved cattle drives, dust storms, and the occasional shootout, dessert didn't need to sparkle. It just needed to remind you that not everything in the West was trying to kill you. Sometimes, something sweet was waiting on a tin plate, served by a cook who might have been an outlaw last week and a preacher the week before. That was the frontier. And on a good night, it was enough. If you were lucky enough to stumble into a saloon before noon, preferably sober and not bleeding, you might have been offered eggs and chicken. And if so, you were in the presence of a miracle. Or a trap. Let's start with the eggs. Fresh eggs in the Wild West were gold. Not actual gold, though in some mining towns, they were worth nearly as much, but equally rare and infinitely more fragile. A single egg could cost a day's wages. A dozen was a fortune. Chickens weren't raised for fun. They were cranky, prone to wandering, and occasionally stolen, eaten, or lost to foxes, coyotes, and the general hazards of frontier life. If a saloon had eggs on hand, they either had their own chickens, which required someone to care for them, feed them, and protect them from predators, a local supplier, which required a reliable chicken farmer, a rarity on the frontier, or a secret smuggling operation from the next town over, which required a network of informants and a willingness to break the law for breakfast. What kind of eggs were they? Hopefully chicken. Possibly duck. Maybe something else entirely. You learned not to ask. You ordered eggs, and what you got depended entirely on the cook's mood and the egg's age. Some were scrambled to disguise color, a grayish hue was best hidden, not admired. Others were fried until the yolks turned to leather, their centers hard and crumbly. And if it wobbled when it hit your plate? That was a sign from the universe to order whiskey instead. As for chicken, it was on the menu, but not often. If it said fried chicken on the board behind the bar, what you'd probably get was a scrawny bird that died angry. Tough, bony, and fried in lard until the flavor tapped out from exhaustion. The drumsticks were the size of your thumb. The breast was stringy. The skin, if you were lucky, was crispy and salty and made the whole endeavor worthwhile. Chicken wasn't always worth the chewing, but it was meat. It was hot. And it wasn't beans again. So folks ate it gratefully. You might get a drumstick the size of your thumb or a whole quarter roasted on an open flame. You might also get a feather in your gravy, and that was just part of the charm. Frontier cooking wasn't about presentation. It was about survival with style, or at least with enough salt to make it palatable. Breakfast offerings of eggs and chicken were a status symbol for saloons. They said, "We have food that didn't come from a can or a barrel. We have access to farms, to fresh ingredients, to something that was alive yesterday and is on your plate today." If the eggs were warm and the chicken wasn't dry, you'd tell your buddies for weeks. "Best breakfast I ever had," you'd say, ignoring the fact that you'd eaten hardtack and jerky for the past month. That saloon knows what they're doing. And if it gave you food poisoning? Well, that was just the West reminding you who was in charge. You'd spend the next day leaning over a railing, contemplating your choices, and promising to stick to whiskey next time. Still, there was something hopeful about ordering eggs. They meant morning. They meant survival. And just maybe, they meant you'd live to drink again by nightfall. In a Wild West saloon, pie was more than just dessert. It was a statement. If you saw a pie sitting on the bar, steam rising, crust golden, the scent of apples or peaches wafting through the smoke and whiskey, you knew this saloon meant business. You also knew that someone in the kitchen had put in real effort, which was practically a love letter in a land of bean slop and overcooked pork. Now, don't get ahead of yourself. Pie in the Wild West wasn't a perfect lattice-topped pastry with farm-fresh fruit and homemade whipped cream. It was a rough, rustic affair. Uneven crusts that had been rolled out by hand, pressed into a pan that had seen better decades. Fillings made from canned or dried fruit. Fresh fruit was a luxury that only appeared when the stars aligned and the orchards produced. And it was usually served lukewarm at best, because the oven had cooled hours ago and no one was going to relight it for one slice. Whipped cream. Not unless a cow followed you into town and volunteered for the job. The most common varieties were apple, peach, or berry being a flexible category that sometimes included raisins, dried currants, or things that only vaguely resembled berries. If the cook had a sweet tooth, you might get a dash of cinnamon. If not, you got crust, sugar, and optimism. Still, pie was a rare treat. Most cowboys hadn't seen one since they left home, where their mothers or wives had baked them in proper kitchens with proper ingredients. Saloons knew that offering pie gave them a competitive edge. A good slice could pull customers from 2 towns over. A great slice could empty the competition's saloon entirely. And if the pie was warm and flaky, you better believe someone would threaten to shoot over the last piece. There are recorded stories, and a few exaggerated legends, of poker games that ended in gunfire over dessert disputes. You took the last slice was as valid an offense as cheating at cards. In a world where men had been stabbed over spilled whiskey, pie was practically sacred. Of course, not all pies were created equal. Some were mostly crust, a thin layer of filling stretched across the bottom, a thick lid of pastry on top. Some were experimental, cooks trying to use up whatever was left in the pantry, creating flavor combinations that would make a modern chef weep. Some had fillings that hinted at being fruit once, in a previous life, before they were boiled down and sweetened into submission. But if the stars aligned, if the cook was sober, the oven was hot, and the fruit wasn't fermenting, that pie was something to remember. Because in the dust and grit of the frontier, a slice of pie wasn't just food. It was hope served on a tin plate. It was a reminder that somewhere, somehow, people still cared enough to make something beautiful. It was a taste of the life you'd left behind, or the life you hoped to build. And for one brief, shining moment, it made the beans and the hardtack and the questionable meat all worth it. In any Wild West saloon that dared serve food, there existed a shadowy, smoke-covered figure whose power rivaled that of the bartender, the sheriff, and the town preacher combined. The cook. This individual, often unshaven, always irritable, and perpetually covered in a layer of grease that had built up over years of frontier cooking, was either a life-saving genius or a culinary war criminal. There was no middle ground. You'd never see them smile. But you'd remember their cooking for days, either in gratitude or gastrointestinal trauma. Saloon cooks weren't trained chefs. They were usually ex-miners, ex-cons, or ex-somethings who knew how to build a fire and weren't afraid of questionable meat. Their kitchen was a fire pit, a dented stove that had been hauled west at great expense, and a single cast iron pan that hadn't been washed since the gold rush. And yet, somehow, they fed entire saloons. On a good day, they'd whip up a pot of chili that could bring a man to tears, in a good way. The biscuits would be warm, the beans cooked through, and the cornbread just sweet enough to remind you of home. You'd sit at the counter, eat your fill, and think that maybe, just maybe, the frontier wasn't so bad. But on a bad day, the beans were scorched, the meat was gray, and the stew had an unsettling layer of oil that moved when the pot was still. You'd take one bite, set down your fork, and order whiskey instead. You didn't complain. You couldn't. Saloon etiquette was clear: never insult the cook. Because the cook controlled everything: the salt, the grease, the mystery meat ratio. If they liked you, you got the freshest cut, the biggest biscuit, the extra dollop of molasses. If not, you got the spoon scrapings from last night's disaster, reheated into chili surprise and served with a smile that promised nothing good. They also doubled as the saloon's unofficial bouncer. No one wanted to get hit by a ladle that had just survived frying salt pork. And if the cook had a cleaver, which many did, they could clear a room faster than a shotgun blast. Despite their moods, these cooks were vital. They kept cowboys on their feet, miners from passing out, and travelers from collapsing mid-sentence. They worked long hours in heat and smoke, taking insults about their seasoning, or lack thereof, with nothing but a grunt and a glare. They lived by a single rule: if you don't like it, there's the door. Or the whiskey. So whether they were your savior or your saboteur, you always nodded respectfully to the cook. Because in the Wild West, they held your stomach and your fate in their greasy, glorious hands. Now that we've walked through the swinging doors, sniffed the stew, and stared down a pickled egg in a foggy jar, the real question remains: would you actually eat the food served at a Wild West saloon? Let's be honest. Modern taste buds might not survive the experience. The beans were basic. The meat was a gamble. The stew was more mystery than meal. You'd need strong teeth, a stronger stomach, and the kind of appetite that comes from riding 40 miles on a sunburned horse with nothing but dust in your lungs and jerky in your saddlebag. But here's the thing. For the cowboys, miners, gamblers, and misfits of the American frontier, saloon food wasn't about gourmet flavor or Instagram-worthy plating. It was about fuel. Calories. Heat. A warm plate between gunfights, train robberies, or another night sleeping in a barn next to a mule named Regret. It was about survival. You didn't ask where the meat came from. You didn't complain if the biscuit crumbled like chalk. You didn't examine the stew for hair or feathers or bootstrings. You just sat down, ate what was handed to you, and washed it down with something strong enough to kill bacteria, or at least make you stop caring about it. And when food was good, when the beans were fresh, the coffee didn't bite back, and the cook had spared a little molasses for the cornbread, it felt like a miracle. So would you eat it? If you lived back then? Yes. You wouldn't just eat it. You'd be thankful for it. You'd scrape the bowl, wipe the plate with your crust of bread, and order seconds with coins that still smelled like dynamite and horse sweat. You'd laugh with strangers, curse the cook, toast with whiskey, and maybe, just maybe, end the night with a slice of pie and a story worth telling. Because saloon food wasn't glamorous. It was gritty, greasy, and real. And in a world where the West was still wild, that was enough. But there was more to saloon food than beans and biscuits. To truly understand it, you have to look at the people who cooked it and the world that shaped it, then lead into part 2. When the kitchen was closed, when the stew looked like it still had a pulse, or when a cowboy simply needed something to take the edge off a long week of cattle drives and close calls, there was always one reliable item on the saloon menu. Whiskey. It was always available. It required no preparation. And if you drank enough of it, you forgot you were hungry, or that you'd just eaten a bowl of squirrel mystery meat that had been sitting in the pot since Tuesday. Whiskey in the Wild West wasn't aged in oak barrels or curated by connoisseurs who could detect notes of vanilla and smoke. It was rough, raw, and often dangerous. Made from corn, rye, or whatever grain the barkeep had lying around, it was distilled in back rooms, barns, and bathtubs by men whose qualifications for alcohol production were limited to, it burns when you drink it. The result was a beverage that could clean wounds, strip paint, and fuel a fist fight. Some called it rotgut. Others called it chain lightning. A few simply referred to it as lunch. When beans were burnt and bread was moldy, men drank their calories one burning shot at a time. Saloon whiskey wasn't just a drink. It was a survival tool. It helped numb the pain of trail dust, heartbreak, broken ribs, and highly questionable stew. One shot before a duel, 2 shots after, and maybe 3 more while you waited to see if your bullet wound was serious. It was an anesthetic, a social lubricant, and a form of currency all rolled into one. It was common for saloons to serve whiskey specials, a shot of the house whiskey accompanied by a side of beans or a biscuit. Not for flavor, but to keep you upright. A man who drank on an empty stomach was a man who'd be on the floor by midnight. A man who ate something, even if that something was a rock-hard biscuit and beans that had been reheated 3 times, might last until last call. Some men ordered whiskey with a pickled egg floating in it, which somehow counted as both hydration and protein. The egg, preserved in vinegar brine, would bob in the amber liquid like a ghostly eyeball, and the combination of sour and strong was an acquired taste that most people never quite acquired. But they drank it anyway. And of course, whiskey was social glue. You bought it to make friends, to start fights, and occasionally to apologize after both. A round of drinks could turn strangers into companions, at least for the night. A refusal to buy a round could turn acquaintances into enemies. In the social calculus of the frontier saloon, whiskey was the variable that could solve almost any equation. You could measure a saloon's reputation by how fast its whiskey knocked a man off his stool. Quality? Don't ask. Some whiskey was barely more than colored moonshine, flavored with whatever the distiller had on hand to make it palatable. Additives ranged from tobacco juice to cayenne pepper to, if the stories are true, turpentine and gunpowder. It burned going down, and if it didn't, you were probably drinking kerosene. Still, no one complained. Because whiskey was warm, cheap, and honest. It was the only thing on the menu that never lied about what it was. It didn't pretend to be a steak when it was really mystery meat. It didn't promise freshness when it had been in the barrel for months. It was whiskey. You knew what you were getting. And on nights when your meal came in a glass, with no fork and no judgment, you raised it high and called it dinner. If you think modern restaurant prices are outrageous, try eating on the frontier. A meal in a Wild West saloon could cost you anywhere from a few pennies to a small fortune, depending on where you were, what you ordered, and whether the cook was feeling generous or vengeful. The standard fare, beans, bread, and coffee, might run you 10 to 25 cents. That doesn't sound like much, but in the 1870s and 80s, a cowboy earned about $30 a month. A quarter was a significant chunk of a day's wages. A steak dinner could cost 50 cents or more, which was practically a luxury. And that was if the saloon was honest. In mining towns, where supply lines were long and demand was high, prices could skyrocket. A single egg might cost $1. A slice of pie could run you 2 bits. A meal that would have cost a dime in Kansas could cost $1 in Deadwood, and you'd be grateful to get it. The economics of frontier food were brutal. Everything had to be shipped in: flour from the Midwest, beans from California, coffee from who knows where. Or it had to be produced locally, which meant someone had to raise chickens, plant gardens, or hunt game, all of which took time and resources that were in short supply. A saloon that could source fresh meat and vegetables had a competitive advantage, but that advantage came at a cost that was passed on to the customer. And then there were the extras. A shot of whiskey to wash down your meal. Another nickel or dime. A second helping of beans. You'd better have another coin in your pocket. A seat at the card table after dinner. That cost whatever you were willing to lose. For many cowboys, a meal in a saloon wasn't just a meal. It was their entertainment, their social life, and their escape from the monotony of trail life. They'd spend money they didn't have on food that barely qualified, just to be somewhere warm and loud and alive. And sometimes, they didn't pay at all. The frontier operated on credit, on barter, on promises made and sometimes kept. A cowboy could eat on credit, promising to pay when the cattle drive ended and the wages came in. A miner could trade a nugget for a week's worth of meals. A gambler could, if he was lucky, let his winnings buy his dinner. But credit could also get you killed. If you owed money to the wrong saloon, or if you were too slow to pay, you might find yourself on the wrong end of a shotgun. Frontier justice was swift, and frontier debt collection was swifter. Some saloons kept ledgers of who owed what, and those ledgers were guarded like treasure. So when you sat down to eat, you ate knowing that every bite had a price. And you paid it. A Wild West saloon wasn't just a restaurant. It wasn't just a bar. It was the beating heart of frontier society, a place where food and drink served as the backdrop for everything else that mattered in a rough, uncertain world. It was a courtroom, a church, a social club, and a battlefield all rolled into one. In towns where there was no courthouse, disputes were often settled at the saloon. A disagreement over a horse, a debt, or a woman could be hashed out over whiskey and beans, with the barkeep acting as judge and the other patrons as jury. If a man was caught stealing, the saloon was where he'd be confronted, and where he might be hanged. In towns where there was no church, the saloon was where men gathered to mourn their dead, to celebrate births, to mark the passage of time. Funerals were often held at the saloon, with a round of drinks raised in honor of the departed. Weddings were celebrated there, the bride and groom sharing a meal with the whole town before heading off to a new life. And of course, the saloon was where news traveled. Before newspapers, before telegraphs, before the Pony Express carried letters across the plains, the saloon was the information hub of the frontier. Travelers brought news from other towns, other territories, other worlds. A man who'd just come from Dodge City could tell you who'd been shot, who'd been hanged, and who'd struck it rich. A miner from the mountains could warn you about which claims were worth working and which were played out. The food was part of that. It was the excuse to gather, to sit at a table, to break bread with strangers who might become friends or enemies before the night was through. And the food itself carried meaning. A saloon that served good food was a saloon that cared about its customers. It was a place where a man could find comfort, where he could sit down to a hot meal and pretend, for a few hours, that he wasn't living on the edge of civilization. A saloon that served bad food was a saloon that didn't care, and word would spread fast: don't eat at the Golden Nugget unless you want to spend the next day regretting it. In that way, the food was a measure of the town itself. A town with good saloon food was a town that was doing well. It had supply lines, reliable sources of fresh ingredients, a cook who knew what he was doing. A town with bad saloon food was a town that was struggling, where even the basics were hard to come by and no one had the time or resources to care about quality. So when you sat down to eat, you were tasting not just the cook's skill but the health of the community. And in the Wild West, that could tell you more about a town than any sign on the edge of the road. The Wild West wasn't one place, and the food wasn't one thing. What you ate in a saloon in Tombstone, Arizona, was different from what you'd find in Deadwood, Dakota Territory, which was different again from San Francisco, California, or Abilene, Kansas. Geography, climate, supply lines, and local culture all shaped the menu. Let's take a tour. Tombstone, Arizona, 1881. Down in the desert, where the heat could kill a man and the water was worth more than whiskey, saloon food was shaped by the realities of the Southwest. Beans were a staple, as always, but they were often cooked with chili peppers, with cumin, with the flavors of the Mexican borderlands. A bowl of chili in Tombstone could make a man sweat, and in the desert, that was a problem, but it was also a comfort. Beef was abundant, if you had the money. Arizona Territory was cattle country, and fresh beef was easier to come by than in many other parts of the West. A steak in Tombstone might actually be a steak, thick, charred, and served with a side of beans and a tortilla if the cook was feeling generous. Tortillas. That was another difference. In the Southwest, flour tortillas and corn tortillas appeared on saloon menus in ways they never did in Kansas or Montana. A cowboy could order frijoles con tortillas and get a meal that would have been familiar in Sonora or Chihuahua. And there was barbacoa, slow-cooked meat, often goat or beef, wrapped in maguey leaves and cooked in a pit. A luxury, to be sure, but one that appeared in the best saloons of Tombstone and Tucson. Deadwood, Dakota Territory, 1876. Up in the Black Hills, where the winters were brutal and the summers short, the food was heartier, more focused on preservation. Game was abundant: deer, elk, buffalo, even bear, and saloons took advantage. A man could order buffalo steak or venison stew and know that the meat had been hunted that week, if not that day. But the winters were long, and fresh food was scarce for months at a time. Saloons in Deadwood relied heavily on salted meats, dried beans, and preserved vegetables. Pickled eggs were a staple, as were pickled onions and pickled beets. A jar of something floating in brine was a common sight behind the bar. And then there was the whiskey. In Deadwood, whiskey was a necessity, not a luxury. The winters could kill a man who wasn't prepared, and a shot of something strong was medicine as much as recreation. The saloons of Deadwood were famous for their whiskey, and the food, hearty, simple, filling, was designed to soak it up. San Francisco, California, 1870s. Now, San Francisco was a different world entirely. A port city with access to fresh seafood, international trade, and a thriving agricultural hinterland, San Francisco's saloons could offer things that would have been unimaginable in Tombstone or Deadwood. Fresh oysters, shipped in from the Pacific, were a common appetizer. Fresh vegetables from the farms of the Santa Clara Valley appeared on plates. Fine wines from Europe and California competed with whiskey for customers' attention. A saloon in San Francisco might serve a hangtown fry, a dish of fried oysters, bacon, and eggs that had originated during the gold rush and become a local legend. It was expensive, decadent, and utterly unlike anything you'd find in a dusty mining town. And the clientele was different, too. San Francisco had wealthy merchants, bankers, and politicians who could afford to eat well. The saloons catered to them, offering menus that rivaled the best restaurants of the East Coast. But even in San Francisco, the basics remained. Beans, bread, coffee, and whiskey were always on the menu. No matter how fancy a saloon got, it never forgot that its customers wanted something familiar, something that tasted like home. Even if home was 1,000 miles away, some saloons became legends, not just for the whiskey they served or the gunfights that happened in their doors, but for the food that kept their customers coming back. Let's visit a few. The Bird Cage Theater, Tombstone, Arizona. The Bird Cage was famous for its entertainment. It was a theater, a saloon, and a gambling hall all in one, but it also served some of the best food in Tombstone. The kitchen turned out steaks that were the envy of the territory, cooked over mesquite wood and served with beans that had been simmering all day. The clientele included the Earp brothers, Doc Holliday, and a rotating cast of outlaws and lawmen, all of whom needed to eat. The legend says that the Bird Cage's cook, a woman named Nellie, could tell a man's character by how he ordered his steak. Rare meant he was impatient and bold. Well done meant he was cautious, maybe even cowardly. And if he asked for ketchup, she'd throw him out before he could finish the sentence. The Long Branch Saloon, Dodge City, Kansas. Dodge City was the queen of the cow towns, and the Long Branch was the queen of its saloons. Made famous by television and movies, the real Long Branch served food that was solid, dependable, and designed for men who'd spent weeks on the trail. The specialty was cowboy steak, a thick cut of beef, fried in lard, served with beans and bread and a cup of coffee strong enough to strip paint. The Long Branch also offered prairie oysters, fried bull testicles, for those with adventurous palates, though most customers stuck to the basics. The Long Branch was also known for its free lunch, a tradition in many saloons where a meal was provided to customers who bought a drink. The free lunch wasn't free, of course, you paid for it in the price of your whiskey. But it was a draw, and the Long Branch's free lunch was legendary: roast beef, fresh bread, pickles, cheese, and sometimes even pie. The Palace Saloon, San Francisco, California. The Palace was the fanciest saloon in the West, a place where millionaires and politicians rubbed elbows with gamblers and adventurers. The menu reflected its status: fresh oysters, imported cheeses, fine wines, and dishes that would have been at home in Paris or New York. The Palace's specialty was miner's omelet, a dish that had originated during the gold rush, made with eggs, bacon, onions, and potatoes, served with sourdough bread that was famous throughout the city. It was simple enough for a working man but prepared with a skill that made it something special. The Palace also served terrapin stew, a dish of turtle meat that was a delicacy in the 1870s, and canvasback duck, hunted in the marshes of California and roasted to perfection. A meal at the Palace could cost a week's wages, but for those who could afford it, it was a taste of civilization in the Wild West. The Bucket of Blood, Virginia City, Nevada. With a name like that, you know the food was an adventure. The Bucket of Blood was a mining town saloon where the food was rough, the whiskey was rougher, and the clientele was roughest of all. But the cook, a man named Charlie, who'd lost 3 fingers to a mining accident and cooked with his left hand, made a chili that was famous throughout the Comstock Lode. The chili was made with beef, beans, chili peppers, and a secret ingredient that Charlie never revealed. Some said it was chocolate. Some said it was human. Whatever it was spicy enough to make a miner forget the aches of a long day underground, and it was cheap enough that even the poorest prospector could afford a bowl. The Bucket of Blood also served mountain oysters, fried bull testicles, a staple of mining town cuisine, and rattlesnake stew for those who wanted something truly frontier. If you've ever watched a Western movie, you've seen the romanticized version of saloon food. A beautiful woman in a calico dress carries a tray of sizzling steaks through the swinging doors. A burly cook in a white apron flips flapjacks with practiced ease. Everyone sits at clean tables, laughing and drinking, while a piano player tinkles out a cheerful tune. The reality was, not that. Myth 1, saloons had full kitchens with professional cooks. Let's bust some myths. Reality, most saloons had a fire pit, a stove, and a cook who might have been a miner last week. The kitchen was often a corner of the bar, separated by a curtain or a half-wall, and the cook was usually the bartender's wife, a hired woman, or a man who couldn't do anything else. Professional chefs were almost unheard of outside of San Francisco and other major cities. Myth 2, the food was served on clean plates with silverware. Reality, plates were often tin, and they were wiped clean with a rag between customers. Silverware was a luxury, most people ate with their hands or with a knife they carried themselves. Forks were rare, and spoons were used only for stew and beans. Myth 3, the menu was written on a chalkboard with elegant script. Reality, if there was a menu at all, it was a shouted list from the cook: beans, stew, or beans and stew. In fancier places, there might be a slate board with prices, but most customers knew what to expect and didn't need to read it. Myth 4, saloons were clean and well lit. Reality, saloons were dark, smoky, and often filthy. Sawdust on the floor was meant to absorb spills and spit, not to create a rustic atmosphere. The tables were sticky, the glasses were cloudy, and the food was prepared in conditions that would make a modern health inspector weep. Myth 5, everyone ate together at long tables, sharing food and stories. Reality, people ate where they could find a seat. Sometimes that meant sharing a table with strangers, sometimes it meant eating standing at the bar. And the stories they shared were often less about adventure and more about who'd been shot, who'd been robbed, and who'd struck it rich. But here's the thing, the myths persist because they're more fun than the reality. And there's a kernel of truth in them. Saloons were places of community, of comfort, of escape. The food was simple, but it was hot. The company was rough, but it was company. And in a world that could be cold and cruel, that was worth something. So when you watch a western and see the hero sit down to a plate of beans and a shot of whiskey, know that it's not quite accurate. But also know that it's closer to the truth than you might think. Because in the Wild West, a meal was never just a meal. It was a moment of peace in a life of chaos. A taste of home in a land of strangers. A reminder that no matter how wild things got, a man still needed to eat. We've talked about the food. We've talked about the saloons. But what about the people who made it all possible? The cooks of the Wild West were a breed apart. They worked in conditions that would have broken lesser men. They dealt with ingredients that had been sitting in barrels for months. They cooked for crowds of hungry, irritable, heavily armed customers who expected a hot meal and a cold drink, and who were not shy about expressing their displeasure. And they did it all with a smile. No. With a scowl, more often. But they did it. Let's meet a few. Mary, Calamity Jane, Cannery. Yes, that Calamity Jane. Before she became a legend as a scout and frontierswoman, Jane worked as a cook in saloons and mining camps across the West. Her cooking was legendary, not for its quality, but for its quantity. She could feed 100 hungry miners with beans, bacon, and bread, and she could do it while drinking whiskey and telling stories that would make a sailor blush. Jane's specialty was camp stew, whatever she had, thrown in a pot, cooked until it was done. It wasn't fancy, but it filled a man's belly, and that was enough. Uncle Billy Smith, the Birdcage Theater. Uncle Billy was the cook at the Birdcage in Tombstone, and he was famous for his steaks. He'd been a cattleman before he became a cook, and he knew meat. He could look at a steer and tell you how it would taste, and he could cook a steak over mesquite wood until it was charred on the outside and tender within. The legend says that Uncle Billy once threw a customer out of his kitchen for complaining about the seasoning. "You don't like my cooking," he said, "you can cook your own damn steak." The customer left, and Uncle Billy's reputation grew. Henrietta Etta Jones, the Palace Saloon. Etta was one of the few professional cooks in the West. She'd trained in San Francisco, worked in restaurants in Chicago, and come west during the gold rush. At the Palace Saloon, she introduced dishes that San Franciscans had never seen: oysters Rockefeller, terrapin stew, canvasback duck. She also made the best sourdough bread in the city, and her miner's omelet was the breakfast of choice for the city's elite. Etta was a perfectionist. She fired 3 cooks in her first week at the palace, and she was known to throw plates at waiters who delivered her food cold. But her food was so good that customers put up with the drama. Charlie, 3 Fingers, O'Malley, the bucket of blood. Charlie lost 3 fingers in a mining accident and turned to cooking because he couldn't swing a pick anymore. He was a terrible cook by any objective measure, but he made a chili that miners swore by. The secret, he said, was love, but the miners suspected it was something else entirely. Charlie was also the saloon's bouncer, because no one wanted to fight a man with 3 fingers and a cleaver. He kept the peace with his cooking as much as his fists, and the bucket of blood was one of the safest saloons in Virginia City. These cooks, and hundreds like them, kept the frontier fed. They worked long hours in heat and smoke, dealing with ingredients that were often suspect and customers who were often drunk. They were the unsung heroes of the Wild West, and without them, the saloons would have been just bars. And a bar without food? That was just a place to drink. With food, it was a home away from home. The Wild West didn't last forever. As the frontier closed, as towns grew into cities, as railroads brought fresh food from across the country, the old saloon culture began to fade. The food changed, too. By the 1890s, many of the old saloons had been replaced by dining saloons, places that served real food, with real menus, in real dining rooms. The rough-and-tumble atmosphere gave way to something more civilized. The cooks were trained professionals. The ingredients were fresh. The customers wore suits instead of chaps. The old saloon food, the beans, the hardtack, the mystery stew, became a memory. It was replaced by roast beef, mashed potatoes, fresh vegetables, and pies made with real fruit. The whiskey got smoother, the coffee got weaker, and the food got better. But something was lost, too. The old saloons had been places where everyone was equal. A cowboy could sit next to a miner, a gambler, a sheriff, and an outlaw, and they'd all eat the same beans and drink the same whiskey. The food was the great equalizer. It didn't matter how much money you had or who you were. When you sat down at a saloon table, you were just another hungry man. The new dining saloons had class distinctions. The rich ate in private rooms. The poor ate at the counter. The food was better, but the camaraderie was gone. And so, the era of saloon food came to an end. But the memory of it lingered. In Western movies, in novels, in the stories passed down from grandfathers to grandchildren, the image of the saloon, with its swinging doors, its sawdust floor, its steaming pot of beans, became a symbol of the frontier. It was a place where a man could find food, drink, and company, all for the price of a few coins and a willingness to take what came. You might think that the food of the Wild West saloons disappeared without a trace. But you'd be wrong. The influence of saloon food can still be felt today, in dishes we eat, in restaurants we visit, in the way we think about food and community. Take chili, for example. The chili that Charlie served at the bucket of blood was a precursor to the chili we know today. The combination of beef, beans, and chili peppers became a staple of American cuisine, and it spread from the mining camps to the cities, from the west to the east. Today, chili is a national dish, served in restaurants and homes across the country. Or take the Hangtown fry, fried oysters, bacon, and eggs. It started as a gold rush dish in California, became a specialty of San Francisco saloons, and is still served today in restaurants that celebrate the culinary history of the West. Or take the simple combination of beans and bread. It's the basis of countless American meals, from the cowboy's campfire to the modern barbecue joint. It's humble, it's filling, and it's a reminder that good food doesn't have to be complicated. The saloon tradition of free lunch, a meal provided to customers who bought a drink, evolved into the modern concept of happy hour. It's still a way for bars to draw customers, still a way for people to gather, still a tradition that connects us to the frontier. And the idea of the saloon as a community hub, a place where people gather to eat, drink, and share stories, is alive and well in the modern gastropub, the neighborhood bar, the family restaurant. We may not eat beans and hardtack anymore, but we still crave the same things: good food, good company, and a place where we belong. So the next time you sit down to a meal at a neighborhood pub, think about the saloons of the Wild West. Think about the cooks who worked over smoky fires, the cowboys who ate beans from a tin plate, the miners who washed down their stew with whiskey that could strip paint. Think about the food that was simple, humble, and honest. And know that you're part of a tradition that goes back more than 100 years. The food has changed. The world has changed. But the need for a hot meal, a cold drink, and a place to call home? That hasn't changed at all. And there we have it, folks, the second chapter of our journey through the culinary world of the Wild West. We've explored the whiskey that fueled the frontier, the economics of a meal, the regional flavors that made each town unique, and the legendary saloons that became part of American mythology. If you've enjoyed this trip through history, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. There's plenty more where this came from the gunfighters who ate at these tables to the women who cooked the meals that kept the West running. Let me know in the comments, what's the most unusual food you've ever eaten? And where are you watching from tonight? I see comments coming in from all over the world, and I love knowing who's along for the ride. Next time, we'll dive into another corner of history, maybe the saloons of the gold rush, maybe the food of the cattle trails, maybe something completely different. Until then, keep your powder dry, your appetite sharp, and your stories ready. Good night, everybody.